Hello, my name is Tim Shoebridge and welcome to this video, the subject of which is adapting lenses to this camera here, the Fujifilm GFX 50R. Now, it's not about adapting any old lenses. This video is specifically about reflex lenses, or mirror lenses as we used to call them. Now, I know what you might be thinking, why bother doing that? No one uses mirror lenses anymore. And that's absolutely true, they don't. But then the upside of that is that there's quite a few out there on the used market and they're quite cheap. Now, I personally have always had a fascination with reflex lenses, going back to when I first got into photography a very long time ago, when I was still a kid. I think I was maybe 9, 10, 11 years old, and my parents bought me this book. It's by a man called Michael Langford. Bless him, I don't know if he's still with us or not. This is quite an old book now. It's called The Step-by-Step Guide to Photography, and it's a fantastic book, and it caught my imagination as a child. It's not just about photographic techniques, but it also goes into sort of darkroom techniques in the film processing, both black and white and colour. And there's a section in here about specialist lenses where it covers the reflex lens and shows you what it can do. But also towards the back of this book, there's a section about developing your own style as a photographer, and it showcases a number of different photographers, very great photographers of the day back then, and it shows you some of their work. And there's a photograph in here, it's a sports photograph of a horse race, and it's shot with a reflex lens, and I absolutely loved the look of that photograph, and from that moment onwards I always wanted to have a reflex lens of my own. So that was quite a few years ago, and in the intervening time I've built up quite a collection of reflex lenses, I have to say. Now, what I'm going to do in this video is try and find a good match of a reflex lens to work with this camera. Adapting film photography lenses and vintage lenses to mirrorless digital cameras like this is a little bit of a hobby of mine, a sort of a little bit of a hobby inside a hobby, if you know what I mean. I really like trying out different lenses, ones that have got some character to them, and seeing what effects I can create with them. So that's what this video is about, finding a suitable mirror lens for this camera and then showing the kind of results that you can get with it. So I really do hope you enjoy this video. Thanks very, very much for watching. Right, so my idea with the Fujifilm GFX 50R is to hopefully use a small, compact reflex lens like this one here. This one's from Tamron. It's a 35mm full frame lens from back in the film days. It's got a Nikon mount on the back of it. You know, if that combination works, then it's really, really small, lightweight. I can take it anywhere and I can get some really interesting shots with it. So that's the kind of idea behind my adapting reflex lenses to this camera. Obviously, I am looking at adapting a 35mm full frame lens to a medium format camera. And reflex lenses are a little bit of a compromise. They're compromised between obviously size and weight. They're very small and compact compared to non-reflex lenses, but they do have some downsides. The first downside is that they have a strong vignette to them. It's just a part of their design. A second downside is that they only have one aperture, a fixed aperture. There's no aperture ring on them. That's the aperture you shoot at. This is a 500mm lens, and it's got an f8 aperture, and that's what you have to use. And the third downside to them is the out of focus bokeh that they produce, the sort of donut shapes that you get, and that's what most people don't like. I really actually quite like them, and I think that they have their place. They certainly can look interesting under certain circumstances depending on the subject. So this is the first lens that I'm going to be testing out. As I said, it's by Tamron. It's called a Tamron SP, and it comes with the sort of the label Adaptall. That's because Tamron made their own bayonet mount on the back, and then they provided some different adapters to fit onto it, so you could fit it to different lens mounts. As I said, this one's got a Nikon lens mount on it, but it's also got a unique feature, this particular lens. It's actually a macro lens. It focuses really very close for a mirror lens, for a reflex lens, down to 5.5 feet. So that's really very, very close for a 500mm lens. So it's a very useful lens if it's good enough and sharp enough. So that's the first lens that I'm going to be testing. The second lens is another 35mm full frame lens from the old film days. It's by Olympus. It's another 500mm f8, which seemed to be quite common at that time. That's it compared to the Tamron, sort of very, very similar size and shape. This has got a beautiful feel to it, this lens. It's a bit heavier than the Tamron. It feels better made. It's got a really sort of like a good resistance and very smooth focus ring to it. I read online that Olympus reflex lenses have a good reputation for being very sharp, so that's why I'm using this one as well. So I'll be testing both of these together and see how they compare. Now, as well as 35mm full frame lenses, because I'm shooting on a medium format camera, I thought I'd try out a medium format reflex lens. This one here is by Mamiya. It's for their 645 film range of system cameras. It's got an integrated lens hood inside it. Again, it's a 500mm f8, so the same specification as these, but obviously there's quite a big difference in size, and that's due to the size of the image circles that each of these has. So if I'm having a problem with vignetting with these 35mm lenses, then hopefully I'm not going to have any problem at all with vignetting with this one, because the image circle is more than enough, big enough to cover the GFX 50R sensor. So as I said, reflex lenses are a compromise, and one of the compromises is sort of image quality and sharpness. They're not going to be as sharp as a non-reflex equivalent lens. So what I thought would be interesting would be to compare those three lenses against a equivalent non-reflex lens. And I've got here, it's very heavy, very large, very heavy. This is a 500mm lens. Again, it's a Mamiya 645 lens. It's got an aperture ring on it. The widest aperture is f5.6. There you go. Very, very big, very, very heavy, but I'm presuming will be a lot sharper, or hopefully, significantly sharper than the mirror lenses. So I'm going to be including this lens in the test. And there's one other lens that I want to include in this test just for fun, and it's this one here. It's even heavier than that 500mm lens. It's made by Nikon. It's a 35mm full frame lens. It's a 1000mm reflex lens. It takes forever to unscrew the lens cap. There we go. So there it is. 1000mm lens. The aperture is f11. But I thought it might be interesting to compare this one as well. Whatever shots I take with it, I'll then reduce them by 50% so that the ultimate size of the subject is the same across all of these lenses, and it'll make for a better comparison. But this is another lens I'll be trying out as well. So there we are. I've got 5 lenses: Tamron, Olympus, Mamiya reflex, Mamiya non-reflex, and the 1000mm from Nikon. Right, so as we're in a state of lockdown at the moment and I'm confined mainly to my garden, but also as we're having some wonderful weather lately with some nice clear skies, I thought that a very interesting subject for these tests might be the moon. So here I am, it's about half an hour before sunset, it's a nice blue skies, and the moon is quite high above the horizon. I'm using the heaviest tripod that I've got, and the most heavy-duty geared tripod head that I've got. I'm also going to be using the self-timer facility on the GFX 50R and the electronic shutter to try and reduce the amount of vibration to an absolute minimum. here's the first lens I'm going to test. This is the Olympus. Focusing with these very long focal length lenses is really very tricky. The tiniest movement of the focus ring can mean the difference between sharp or totally blurred. So I am going to end up taking quite a few photographs with each of the lenses, and then when I get those photographs loaded onto my computer, I'll choose the sharpest one. And with the non-reflex lens that's got an aperture ring, I'll also be taking photographs at each of the apertures and choosing the sharpest. And actually with this particular lens I found a very clear winner at f11. Certainly the sharpest images are at f11 with that lens. Right, so here are the results of those test shots here in Lightroom. Now what I've done is I've taken the very sharpest of each set of images that I shot for each lens. So here we've got 5 images, one for each lens. The one on the left here is the Mamiya 500mm reflex lens. This one, as you can see by the much bigger moon, this is the Nikon 1000mm. Then we have got the Olympus 500mm, then we've got the Tamron, and then finally on the right hand side here we've got the non-reflex lens, the Mamiya 500mm f5.6 lens. This particular one is the one shot at f11, which was the sharpest of the series of images I took for that lens. Now I just want to come back to this Nikon 1000mm lens. Like I said at the beginning, I've reduced the size of it by 50%. So if we look at, say, this first one here, the resolution is 8256 by 6192. But the Nikon 1000mm lens shot is half that. It's 4128 by 3096. So if I were to take it and say the one next door to it and compare them side by side and then zoom in to 100%, we will see that actually the images, or the size of the moon in each case, is the same size. Now while we've got this blow up of the moon here, I have to say that it's only now I'm analysing the results that I realised that the choice of the moon as the subject was probably not the best choice. It's not a very contrasty image at all. There's very little contrast here, even with the sharp lens. The best way to sort of gauge the sharpness is this bottom edge here of the moon around the bottom, where you can see that there are shadows catching the craters. This is where the most contrast is, and so this is where I've been really concentrating, looking here to try and compare image to image to see how sharp or otherwise they are. So I'll run through and I'll show you those 100% zoomed in portions of the bottom of the moon for each of these images. But I have been poring over the results a lot, and I can see that this one here on the left here is actually the least sharp. I've actually ordered them, as you can see by the little stars that I've rated them with. So the least sharp of all of the lenses was the Mamiya 500mm reflex lens. Now that might not be a surprise. It's an old technology lens. It's quite an old lens, probably the oldest of all of them, and it's meant to be for film, and it's meant to be for a film format size that's actually quite a lot bigger than the GFX 50R sensor size, whereas the other lenses are all for 35mm, so they'll have the smallest image circles and generally be more, provide more detail. So the 500mm Mamiya reflex lens was the least sharp of them all. Next, in terms of the least sharp, was a bit of a surprise to me. It's the Nikon 1000mm. Even though it's double the magnification, which means we should be capturing a lot more detail. And then when we reduce it down by 50%, it should be a super sharp image, but actually it was quite disappointing. Better than the Mamiya, but not as good as the other reflex lenses. Third in this test came out to be the Olympus. So this is the Olympus and this is the Tamron. And I was really expecting the Olympus to be better than the Tamron. It's got a better reputation. It seemed to be a more professional and sort of better build quality of a lens. But actually it was just a little bit less sharp and less contrasty than the Tamron. So it's third place. So the Tamron is second place. In fact, it's first place as far as all the reflex lenses are concerned. It's the sharpest out of those 4 different reflex lenses, which is a big surprise to me, I have to say, but it really is very sharp and looks really nice image. The only lens that's sharper than it is the non-reflex lens, the Mamiya 500mm f5.6, and this lens is at its sharpest at f11. Now, you know, there's not a massive difference in sharpness from the very best to the very worst. That none of these lenses are a dud. They're all doing a good job, and let's face it, you know, we shouldn't be pixel peeping and zooming into 100%, as a normal approach to looking at images. So, you know, there is a variation between them from best to worst, but it is not massive. But certainly out of the reflex lenses, the Tamron is the sharpest. Right, so that's the end of the testing, and I'm really quite surprised at the results. I'm really quite surprised at how poorly the Nikon lens did, and I'm really very surprised at how well the Tamron lens did. And the reason why I say that is because this lens is so cheap. It cost me under £200. I think it was £190 I paid for this lens, and I was really expecting it to be not particularly good image quality compared to the others, certainly compared to the Olympus lens, which feels like a lot better quality and has a very good reputation online. Now maybe I've got a particularly daft version of the Olympus lens and a very good version of the Tamron lens. Obviously that's a possibility, but none of these lenses look like they've been tampered with, and they look like they've been kept in very good condition. So I don't really think so. I think that this is a little bit of a hidden jewel, this Tamron lens. And the reason why I'm so happy about it being such a good performer is that it's the macro lens. Out of all the other lenses, it's the macro lens. It focuses very, very closely. And so there's a good opportunity to pair it with the GFX 50R and get some interesting creative results with it. So that's what's going to come up next. I'm going to show you some of the photos that I've shot with this lens. Now, we're in a coronavirus COVID-19 lockdown scenario right now. I can't go out and take photos. So I'm limited to my garden, and I'm limited to a park that's just up the street where I go and do some exercise. So the subjects that I'm shooting here are nature and flowers and things like that, and I'm a bit limited with the subject matter. But anyway, here are some photographs now that I've shot with this lens, just to show you some of the potential. I really do recommend you taking a look at it if you're interested in the results that I'm showing you here. It's a cheap lens, it's a lot of fun. And it's really lightweight, portable. It weighs a lot less than the camera. So that's it. Until the next video that I do on the GFX 50R, thanks very, very much for watching.